Welcome to Shadow Frames, where forgotten images reveal their darkest secrets. Today, we examine a photograph that appears innocent at first glance, a birthday celebration from 1909. The image shows two children, identical twins, seated at a table adorned with a simple cloth and a homemade cake between them. The photograph is sepia-toned, the edges slightly frayed from handling over the decades. 5 small candles stand proudly on the modest cake, their flames captured mid-flicker by the camera's long exposure. The twins wear matching outfits, sailor-inspired garments typical of the Edwardian era, their hair neatly combed and parted to the side. Both children stare directly into the camera with the serious expressions common in photography of this period. No smiles, just solemn faces beneath the weight of remaining still for the photographer's instruction. Behind them we can make out wallpaper with an intricate floral pattern and the corner of what appears to be a piano, markers of a middle-class household of the early 20th century. A woman's hand is visible at the edge of the frame, likely a mother steadying herself against the table, careful not to disturb the composition. Nothing about this image seems particularly unsettling at first inspection. Yet there is something in the stillness of the scene that gives us pause. The photograph bears an inscription on its reverse in faded, elegant handwriting. Edward and Thomas, 5th birthday, June 12, 1909. A treasured memory preserved for posterity. A celebration of young lives. What the image doesn't tell us, what no one would know without diving into the historical records, is that only one child survived beyond this birthday. Parish records from the local church, discovered in our research, indicate that Thomas became ill with scarlet fever mere weeks after this photograph was taken. By autumn, only Edward remained. More disturbing still is what our analysis of the photograph itself reveals. Modern digital enhancement of the image shows subtle differences in light refraction around the figures. The boy on the right, identified as Thomas from other family photographs, appears slightly translucent when examined under specialized lighting conditions. This raises a chilling possibility. Was Thomas already gone by the time of this photograph? Did the grieving family stage this birthday scene with only one living child, creating the illusion of twins still united in celebration? Some photographic experts suggest this image may represent early spirit photography, a practice popular in the Victorian and Edwardian eras where grieving families would attempt to capture images of deceased loved ones alongside the living. Others point to the precisely identical posture of both children, suggesting photographic manipulation, an early form of double exposure perhaps, creating two images of the same child. What makes this photograph truly unsettling is not knowing which interpretation is correct. Is this the last birthday two living children shared together? Or is it evidence of a family's desperate attempt to preserve the memory of twins as they should have been, rather than accepting the harsh reality that only one remained? Our investigation deepened when we located Edward's descendants. His granddaughter Marion hesitantly showed us additional family artifacts stored in her attic, a worn leather album containing more photographs and several journal entries written by the twins' mother, Elizabeth. The journal revealed troubling details. Thomas had actually fallen ill 3 months before the birthday, in March of 1909. Elizabeth wrote of nights without sleep, and prayers that seemed to echo unanswered in our desperate home. Most telling was her entry from April 2nd. The doctor says prepare ourselves, but how does one prepare for half their heart to cease? Yet surprisingly, subsequent entries reference Thomas as if still present. Elizabeth mentions bathing both boys and preparing their favorite meals. By May, her entries become increasingly disjointed, describing conversations with Thomas that couldn't possibly have occurred if the parish records were accurate. The photographs in the album tell their own disturbing story. In images dated before March, both boys appear solid and distinct, with subtle differences in their faces that only a parent or careful observer might notice. After March, only single portraits of Edward exist, except for the birthday photograph in question. We consulted Dr. Helena Winthrop, a specialist in early 20th century post-mortem photography. The Edwardian period represented a transition in mourning practices, she explained. While Victorian families openly embraced memorial photography, displaying deceased loved ones in elaborate settings, The early 1900s saw this practice becoming more private, more discreet. What's unusual here, Dr. Winthrop continued while examining our digital scans, is the apparent attempt to create not a memorial image, but an alternative reality, one where the family milestone occurred as it should have, with both children present. Further investigation uncovered medical records from the local physician who treated the family. His notes indicate multiple visits to the home, not only for Thomas's illness, but also for Elizabeth, who was prescribed laudanum for extreme nervous distress and persistent delusions regarding her deceased child. Perhaps most unsettling was our discovery of a receipt from a photography studio in the nearest city, dated 1 week before the birthday. The itemized services included specialized plate preparation and double exposure techniques, along with an unusually high fee. Edward lived until 1982, becoming a photographer himself. His early work, preserved in a university archive, shows a curious preoccupation with capturing siblings together, often using experimental techniques to create ethereal effects around his subjects. Marion shared one final artifact, a letter Edward wrote to his own daughter on her 30th birthday. In it, he confesses, "Mother always insisted we both live to see 5 candles on that cake. Father indulged her by creating the photograph she needed. I grew up looking at that image on our mantel, taught to speak of my brother as if he were merely in another room. It was only at 16 that I finally learned the truth. I had been alone far longer than I knew." The birthday photograph, seemingly innocent, represents more than deception or delusion. It captures the intersection of grief, love, and early photographic technology. A family's attempt to create an alternative history where death had not yet severed an irreplaceable bond. The true extent of Elizabeth's decline became apparent when we discovered a hidden compartment in the leather album's binding. Inside was a small brass key wrapped in silk, along with a note in Elizabeth's handwriting. For the nursery cabinet, only on birthdays. Marion had never seen this key before, but recognized the reference immediately. A mahogany cabinet remained in what had once been the children's nursery, now used as a guest bedroom in her childhood home. When we visited the house, still in the family's possession but rarely used, the lock turned with surprising ease. Inside the cabinet lay evidence of Elizabeth's elaborate deception. Identical sets of children's clothing, meticulously maintained. 2 pairs of shoes polished to perfection. Twin hairbrushes with fine blonde hairs still entangled in the bristles. Most disturbing were the birthday gifts, not just for the 5th birthday captured in our photograph, but for every subsequent year until what would have been the twins' 18th birthday. Each gift was wrapped in delicate paper, labeled with both names. Edward's packages showed signs of being opened and then carefully rewrapped. Thomas's remained perfectly sealed, pristine in their presentation. Grandmother insisted on celebrating their birthdays together until the day she died, Marion whispered, running her fingers over the dusty packages. Grandfather would take her to Thomas's grave in the morning. Then they would return home for cake with 2 slices cut. 1 plate would sit untouched throughout the evening. Parish records contained another revelation. Elizabeth had arranged and paid for a second headstone for Thomas, this one bearing a death date 6 years after his actual passing. The stone was placed in a different cemetery across town. Cemetery logs showed Elizabeth visited both graves regularly, bringing different flowers to each. We located Edward's personal physician, now in his 90s but still sharp-minded. Edward struggled with what psychologists would now call identity confusion, he explained. Having been raised alongside a phantom brother for so many years, he often spoke of feeling incomplete, as if he were only half of a whole person. The doctor described how Edward would occasionally sign correspondence as Thomas, particularly during periods of stress. He once told me he could sometimes feel his brother's thoughts forming alongside his own, that he carried 2 souls within one body. Among Edward's possessions, Marion found a collection of small handmade books, stories written from Thomas's perspective, describing the life he might have lived. The handwriting evolved from childish scrawl to mature script, all crafted by Edward as he grew older. The photograph studio that created the birthday image remained in operation through the 1950s. Their archived records mentioned the family by name, noting them as regular customers who required special services annually. An apprentice who later took over the business documented their techniques, revealing that Edward was photographed twice, once on each side of the table, with the images skillfully combined to create the illusion of twins. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the school enrollment form we discovered, dated 2 years after Thomas's death. Elizabeth had registered both boys for primary education, providing identical information for each. The headmaster's notation in the margin reads simply, "Informed of situation by father. Will accommodate mother's visits, but only one child will attend." The birthday photograph serves as a powerful artifact of how grief can reshape reality, how a family's unwillingness to accept loss created an elaborate alternate world where both twins continued to exist, one in flesh, the other in carefully constructed memory. The disturbing implications of our investigation extended further when we examined the back of the birthday photograph more closely. Behind the inscription, barely visible under ultraviolet light, appeared a different message. "Only one breathes, but two must remain." This led us to the town census records from 1910, where Elizabeth had insisted that both children be counted. The census taker made a curious notation. "Wife unstable. Husband reports twin deceased previous year, but female insistent on recording both. Acquiesced to prevent disturbance." More troubling still was what we found in the family doctor's private correspondence. In a letter to a colleague dated 1915, he described treating Edward for unexplained bruising and a fractured wrist. The boy claimed to have fallen, but the doctor noted his suspicion that Elizabeth had punished Edward for failing to maintain the charade of his brother's continued existence. The mother alternates between addressing the boy as Edward or Thomas, the doctor wrote, depending on which personality she prefers that day. The child has adapted by responding to both names and adjusting his behavior accordingly. I fear for his psychological development, but the father resists my suggestion of intervention. Marion recalled stories about her grandmother that family members had whispered when they thought children weren't listening. She would set the dinner table for 4 rather than 3, and sometimes they would find her in the twins' room at night, reading bedtime stories to an empty bed. The most disturbing evidence emerged when we explored the attic of the family home. Behind a false wall, we discovered a child-sized mannequin dressed in Thomas's clothing. Its face had been painted to resemble the deceased boy, with glass eyes that caught the light in an unnervingly lifelike manner. Surrounding it were toys arranged as if in mid-play, abandoned yet carefully maintained. A local craftsman's ledger, preserved in the town's historical society, contained an order from Elizabeth for a life-size figure for theatrical purposes 6 months after Thomas's death. The craftsman had added a personal note. "Most peculiar commission. Customer insistent on exact measurements and coloring. Will not ask questions." Edward's early school reports revealed another dimension to the tragedy. His teacher noted that he would sometimes appear to consult with an invisible companion before answering questions, and reserves an empty seat beside him at all times. By age 10, these behaviors had largely disappeared, replaced by what the teacher described as an unusual maturity and resignation beyond his years. The family's parish priest, writing in his private journal, described being called to the home after Elizabeth suffered what appeared to be a nervous collapse in 1916. Found her cradling the artificial child, insisting it had fallen ill again. The husband appears broken by years of maintaining this fiction. The living son watches from doorways, a shadow in his own home. I pray for them all, but fear the damage cannot be undone. What began as a grieving mother's inability to accept loss had transformed into an elaborate system of denial that imprisoned an entire family. The birthday photograph wasn't merely a manipulated image. It was the cornerstone of an alternative reality that Elizabeth constructed and maintained through increasingly desperate means, forcing her surviving son to inhabit 2 identities at once. As our investigation approached its conclusion, we felt compelled to understand how Edward had managed to form his own identity despite growing up in the shadow of a phantom twin. We located his college application essays, preserved in university archives, which provided a window into his evolving self-perception. "I have lived 2 lives simultaneously," he wrote at 17. "One my own, the other belonging to someone who exists only in family mythology. I have decided to study photography not merely as profession, but as exploration, to understand how images can both preserve truth and manufacture elaborate lies. Edward's early adulthood showed remarkable resilience. Upon leaving home for university in 1922, he began writing letters to his mother signed only as Edward, gently but firmly establishing boundaries. Elizabeth's responses, however, continued addressing both sons until her death in 1931. Among Elizabeth's personal effects, we discovered a locked diary from her final years. The entries revealed moments of lucidity amidst persistent delusion. "I know what I have done," she wrote in one particularly clear passage. "Created a ghost and forced my living child to share his existence with it. I tell myself it was love, but perhaps it was selfishness. I could not bear to be the mother of just one when I had carried two." The Photograph Studio's archives contained a heartbreaking request from Edward, dated 1933, 2 years after Elizabeth's death. He commissioned a new image, this time deliberately removing Thomas from the birthday photograph through early retouching techniques. The accompanying note read, "I wish to see myself as I truly was, alone." This modified photograph was found among Edward's most personal possessions, kept in his bedside table rather than displayed. Marion remembered questioning her father about it once. "Dad told me it was his way of finally meeting himself, of seeing the boy who had been hidden behind the performance of being twins." Perhaps most poignant was the letter Edward wrote to his unborn grandchild, Marion's child, just months before his death. "There is a family legacy I hope ends with me," he wrote. "The weight of carrying another's identity. My mother loved a ghost so fiercely that the living child became secondary. I have spent a lifetime disentangling myself from my brother's memory. Remember this. Love the child who stands before you, not the one you wish was there instead." The birthday photograph that began our investigation now reveals its true nature, not as supernatural phenomenon, but as evidence of how grief can distort reality. The camera captured not spirits, but the beginnings of an elaborate fiction that would shape multiple lives for decades. We returned the photograph to Marion, who placed it in an album alongside Edward's retouched version, two interpretations of reality separated by years of painful understanding. She has since donated Elizabeth's journals to a medical university studying historical approaches to grief and mental health, hoping that her family's tragedy might inform modern treatment approaches. Grandfather ultimately found himself, Marion told us as we concluded our investigation. But the journey cost him his childhood. The real ghost wasn't Thomas. It was the persistent illusion that Edward could somehow be both himself and his brother simultaneously. The most unsettling discoveries came when we examined Edward's photography career more thoroughly. His university portfolio contained a series titled The Missing Half, featuring children photographed beside empty chairs, their shadows artificially elongated to form second silhouettes. His professors noted these works showed technical brilliance, but disturbing preoccupation with absence. In 1942, Edward opened his own studio specializing in family portraits. His appointment books, preserved by a former assistant, revealed a peculiar pattern. He refused to photograph twins or siblings of similar age, referring these clients to competitors. When asked why, he reportedly said, "Some resemblances should not be captured." We located several families who had commissioned portraits from Edward during this period. Harriet Kensington, now in her 90s, recalled bringing her children to his studio in 1956. He was particular about positioning, never allowed siblings to sit too close together. When my daughters held hands, he became visibly distressed and asked them to separate. The resulting photograph shows them with an unusual amount of space between them, as if room had been left for someone else. Edward's technical notes revealed his development of what he called separation techniques, photographic methods ensuring each subject remained distinctly isolated within group portraits. "Each person must exist independently within the frame," he wrote. "No merging of shadows, no suggestion of one identity bleeding into another." His marriage record showed another manifestation of his childhood trauma. When Edward wed Catherine Miller in 1936, he requested an unprecedented clause in their marriage certificate, asking the officiant to explicitly state he was wedding Edward alone, rather than using the traditional joining together. Catherine later told her sister in correspondence that Edward awakened from nightmares repeatedly asking, "Which one does she see when she looks at me?" Most revealing was a project Edward never completed. In 1970, he began collecting photographs of identical twins from across the country, intending to create an exhibition exploring visual identity. His notes for the abandoned project include the haunting observation: "In every pair, I search for the one who carries both souls, the survivor who will inevitably be left to exist for two." When Edward's own children were born, a daughter and 5 years later, a son, his parenting philosophy became evident through family letters. "Each child must be seen entirely for themselves," he wrote to his brother-in-law. "I forbid comparison between them. No matching clothes, no shared birthday celebrations despite the dates falling in the same month. They will not share the burden of merged identity that was forced upon me." Marion showed us one final artifact, a camera Edward modified himself, containing 2 lenses but only 1 plate for capturing images. He never used it professionally, but kept it on his desk throughout his life. Inscribed on its base were the words, "2 views, 1 reality. The truth lives between." The birthday photograph that began our investigation represents more than family tragedy. It documents the birth of a psychological burden that Edward spent his entire life trying to understand and ultimately escape. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when we visited the former family church. The elderly groundskeeper remembered the twins' father, George, as a man hollowed out by his wife's refusal to accept reality. He directed us to a small storage room where parish records were kept before digitization. Among these, we discovered George's private correspondence with the minister spanning over a decade. The letters revealed George's desperate attempts to balance maintaining family stability with addressing Elizabeth's deteriorating mental state. In one particularly heartbreaking letter dated December 1913, he wrote, "I fear I have committed a grievous sin in allowing this fiction to persist. Edward asked me yesterday if Thomas is invisible to everyone except Mother, or if something is wrong with his own eyes for not seeing him properly. How does one explain to a child that his mother's love has become a prison?" George's diaries, later found in a local historical society collection, detailed his own quiet resistance. He would take Edward on regular fishing trips, journeys Elizabeth refused to join because Thomas disliked the water. These excursions became sacred spaces where Edward could temporarily exist as just himself. "Today he laughed freely for the first time in months," George wrote after one such outing in 1914. Away from her gaze, he sheds the performance. "I saw glimpses of who he might become if freed from this charade. When we returned home, I watched the light dim in his eyes as he resumed his double role." The family's former neighbors, interviewed by telephone, recalled Edward's adolescent rebellion at 16. For 3 weeks, he refused to acknowledge the phantom twin, answering only to his own name and removing Thomas's place setting from the table each evening. Elizabeth's response was a suicide attempt that effectively ended his resistance. After the hospital incident, he surrendered completely, the neighbor recalled. Began referring to himself as we when speaking to his mother. George aged years in those few weeks. Perhaps the most illuminating document was Edward's application to a psychology course in his 30s, where he described his unusual childhood in clinical terms for the first time. "I experienced what might be termed enforced dissociative identity, not manifesting as distinct personalities within myself, but rather being required to maintain and interact with an external identity that existed only in another's perception." Edward's later photography incorporated subtle references to his experience. Several of his landscape images, seemingly conventional at first glance, contain digitally altered reflections in water that don't match the subjects above, a visual metaphor for the disconnection between reality and perception that defined his early years. The birthday photograph remains a powerful artifact of family trauma disguised as celebration. The 5 candles on that cake marked not just the passage of years, but the beginning of Edward's conscious awareness of his dual existence. By capturing both twins together, the photograph immortalized the precise moment when illusion was elevated above reality, when a family chose to preserve a comforting fiction rather than face the singular truth of who remained. Perhaps the most profound insight into Edward's fractured childhood came from an unexpected source: his elementary school art teacher, Miss Adelaide Peterson. Now in her 102nd year, she resides in a care facility near the original family home. Her memory remains remarkably sharp, particularly regarding Edward. "That poor boy was drawing two of everything," she told us, her weathered hands trembling as she sketched in the air. 2 houses, 2 trees, 2 suns in the sky. When asked why, he would whisper that one was for the world everyone could see, and one was for Thomas's world, a place that existed alongside our own, but slightly out of phase. Miss Peterson preserved several of Edward's childhood drawings, protected in acid-free sleeves. The most striking shows a family portrait where Edward depicted himself with a dotted outline, while Thomas appears more solidly rendered. When asked about this artistic choice, Edward had reportedly said, "Mother sees him clearer than me." The teacher had attempted to intervene, approaching George after school one afternoon. "His father just looked defeated," she recalled. "He told me, 'We've created a ghost that's more real than my living son.' I never forgot those words, or the resignation in his eyes." We uncovered school administration records showing that Elizabeth volunteered as a classroom mother, insisting on preparing 2 of everything for Edward: 2 desks, 2 sets of supplies, 2 name tags. The principal's notes indicate they accommodated these requests temporarily to avoid distressing the child further during transition to school. Most revealing was a recording we discovered in the town's oral history project, an interview with Edward himself conducted when he was 73. The interviewer had asked about his childhood influences, unaware of the family's complex history. "I existed in stereo," Edward explained after a long pause. "Every experience echoed. Every joy or pain was immediately translated into how it would affect someone who wasn't there. I couldn't scrape my knee without Mother rushing to check if Thomas had somehow injured himself too. I couldn't receive a gift without a matching present being placed on my brother's empty bed." He continued, his voice growing softer. "Photography became my salvation because it forced a reckoning with what was physically present before the lens. The camera cannot capture what isn't there. It is brutally, mercifully honest in that way." The interviewer, clearly uncomfortable, attempted to redirect the conversation, but Edward persisted with remarkable candor. "I sometimes wonder who I might have become if allowed to be just one person. There's a mathematical concept called phantom limb space, the area that would be occupied by a missing appendage. I've lived my life in my brother's phantom limb space, feeling the contours of his absence more keenly than the substance of my own presence." This recording, largely forgotten in the archives, provides perhaps the most authentic perspective on how the birthday photograph and the elaborate fiction it represented shaped an entire life, transforming what should have been a celebration of growing older into a painful reminder of a divided existence. The university archives yielded one final revelation that cast the birthday photograph in an entirely new light. Edward had donated his complete photographic equipment to the institution upon retirement, including darkroom tools and technical journals spanning 6 decades. Among these was a notebook labeled "Experiments in Sympathetic Exposure," containing technical formulas and processes he developed privately but never published. His notes described a chemical treatment for photographic plates that he believed could capture emotional residue, or what he termed psychological impressions, left in spaces where significant events occurred. Edward had developed this technique after repeatedly noticing unexplained anomalies in photographs taken in locations with tragic histories. "The emulsion responds not only to light but to concentrations of human suffering," he wrote. "What we interpret as photographic artifacts may actually be the visualization of emotional energy absorbed by physical spaces." Most disturbing was his analysis of the original birthday photograph, which he revisited scientifically throughout his life. In 1967, using specialized equipment, Edward discovered that the cake in the image showed signs of what he called temporal distortion. Parts of it appeared to exist at different moments in time simultaneously. The candles burn at different rates within the same exposure, his notes read, as if time itself had fractured around this moment, creating multiple overlapping realities within a single frame. Edward's granddaughter Marion shared with us his final project, never exhibited or shown to anyone outside the family. In his 80s, Edward had returned to the original family home, setting up his camera in precisely the same position where the birthday photograph had been taken 75 years earlier. Using his specialized chemical treatments, he captured a series of long exposures of the empty dining room. The resulting images are profoundly unsettling. Though the room was vacant, indistinct childlike figures appear around the table, not clear apparitions, but disruptions in the visual field that follow human proportions. Most notable is that these forms are not identical. One appears solid, anchored to the chair on the left. The other is fragmentary, dispersing at the edges like smoke, seated where Thomas would have been. Grandfather believed that moments of extreme psychological distress could create what he called emotional echoes, imprints in space-time that sensitive photographic processes might detect. Marion explained. He spent his final years trying to prove that the birthday photograph captured not just his mother's delusion, but an actual fracture in reality. A moment when grief briefly tore open the barrier between what was and what might have been. Edward's final journal entry, written 3 days before his death, contains a single haunting line. Perhaps Thomas wasn't entirely gone. Perhaps Mother saw what the camera could see, that in moments of profound loss, those we've lost continue to occupy the spaces we've reserved for them, just slightly out of phase with our reality. This scientific approach to what began as family tragedy suggests a disturbing possibility, that the birthday photograph might contain elements of both deception and truth, capturing not just a mother's refusal to accept loss, but the genuine echo of a life cut short, still resonating through the place that should have witnessed his growth. The portrait studio that produced the haunting birthday photograph became a focal point of our investigation. Located on Sycamore Street, the establishment, Abernathy & Sons Photographic Services, operated from 1893 until 1962. The building still stands, converted now into a small art gallery that specializes in historical photography. The current owner allowed us access to the basement where original equipment and business records remained largely untouched. Among ledgers of appointments and expenses, we discovered a separate journal kept by Harold Abernathy, the photographer who created the twins' birthday image. Abernathy's private notes revealed he had specialized in what he euphemistically called comfort photography for grieving families. His technical descriptions detail methods for creating the illusion of deceased family members among the living, techniques far more sophisticated than typical Victorian mourning photographs. The mother arrived first, alone, Abernathy wrote regarding Elizabeth's commission. She spoke of her sons in present tense, though I had heard of the family's loss. Rather than contradict her reality, I offered my services in creating what she needed to see. Most revealing was his description of Edward during the photographic session. The child sits with perfect stillness, eyes shifting occasionally to the empty chair as if taking cues from it. When instructed to move slightly, he asks if his brother should move as well. The father stands behind me, silent, his expression unreadable. This is the 8th such commission from families in our town this year alone. The phenomenon extended beyond Edward's family. Parish records showed an unusual spike in child mortality between 1905 and 1910, a localized outbreak of scarlet fever, diphtheria, and influenza that claimed 47 children under the age of 12. Abernathy's studio had developed something of a specialization in response. His appointment books show multiple sessions labeled with cryptic notations: presence work or completion portrait. A medical historian we consulted explained that this period represented a collision between increasing child survival expectations and the harsh realities of pre-antibiotic medicine. By the early 20th century, parents had begun to expect their children would survive to adulthood. When that expectation was violated, the psychological impact was profound, she explained. Community resources for processing grief were primarily religious, offering spiritual comfort, but little practical psychological support. Abernathy seemed aware of his unusual role. A letter to his son and apprentice, dated 1917, offers this reflection. Our work serves two purposes: documentation of what is, but increasingly, creation of what should have been. I sometimes question the ethics of perpetuating these illusions, yet have witnessed the peace they bring. The camera can lie compassionately. Edward's birthday photograph wasn't an isolated phenomenon, but part of a larger cultural response to grief during a transitional period in medical and social history. The town itself had become a place where reality was collectively negotiated through images, where photography served not just to record moments, but to create alternate possibilities, allowing families to briefly inhabit worlds where death had not taken their children. The twins' birthday image thus represents not just one family's response to loss, but an entire community's attempt to use emerging technology to soften unbearable reality, creating visual spaces where grief could be temporarily suspended and broken families could appear whole again, if only in the realm of silver gelatin and carefully controlled light. The lingering questions around Edward's experience led us to examine medical literature from the period. We discovered a 1913 medical journal containing a case study that, while not naming the family directly, described a situation remarkably similar to Edward's. Written by Dr. James Forrester, the town's secondary physician, it detailed a psychological adaptation phenomenon in surviving identical twins. Dr. Forrester documented how the surviving child manifested behaviors that mirrored aspects of the deceased sibling's personality, particularly when under maternal observation. He theorized this represented not a supernatural occurrence but a profound form of empathetic response, the living child unconsciously attempting to fulfill the emotional needs of grieving parents. The subject demonstrates remarkable psychological plasticity, Forrester wrote. When the mother enters the room, subtle shifts in posture, vocal patterns, and preferences occur almost instantaneously. The child effectively becomes two people simultaneously, a form of defensive adaptation that preserves the family system at significant cost to individual development. We located Dr. Forrester's descendants, who granted access to his unpublished research materials. His private notes revealed he had followed Edward's case until the boy was 14, documenting the increasing sophistication of what he termed twin simulation behaviors. Most disturbingly, he recorded instances where Edward would engage in conversations with himself in different voices when alone, maintaining the performance even in private. The adaptation has become internalized, Forrester noted. The subject now maintains the dual identity structure independent of external observation. The boundary between performance and authentic expression has effectively dissolved. Further insight came from the diary of Josephine Winters, Edward's childhood piano teacher, who visited the home weekly for lessons. Her entries describe Elizabeth insisting that both boys receive instruction, setting two piano stools side by side. The poor child plays a piece, then slides to the other stool and plays a deliberately different version, sometimes making intentional mistakes he would never make himself, she wrote. When I suggested teaching just Edward, the mother became so agitated I feared for her stability. The father later explained this charade was necessary for maintaining household peace. Most poignant was Josephine's description of Edward's musical compositions. He writes duets exclusively, pieces that require 4 hands on the keyboard. When performing alone, he plays both parts, stretching uncomfortably to reach keys on opposite ends of the instrument rather than adapting the music for solo performance. It's as if acknowledging the absence of the second player would make the loss unbearable. The birthday photograph, viewed through this additional context, becomes more than evidence of photographic manipulation. It documents the moment when a temporary comforting fiction began transforming into an enduring psychological reality, one that would reshape Edward's developing identity at the most fundamental level. A child who should have been celebrating his 5th year of life was instead being trained to partially cease existing as himself, to become a living memorial that preserved not just the memory, but the active presence of the deceased. The 5 candles on that cake marked not just age, but the beginning of a divided existence that would continue to cast shadows across decades of Edward's life. Our examination took an unexpected turn when we discovered Edward's personal journals from his time at university. Hidden among academic notes were detailed sketches of what he called the separation process, his conscious attempts to disentangle his identity from Thomas's phantom presence. "I have begun to map the boundaries," he wrote in 1923. "There are moments when I reach for objects with my left hand, though I am right-handed. Words appear in my mind that I would never choose. Songs I have never learned play perfectly through my fingers. These, I believe, are Thomas's traces, the parts of him I was taught to incorporate." The journal documented Edward's systematic efforts to isolate these inherited behaviors and consciously suppress them. He developed elaborate exercises, timing how long he could maintain what he called singular existence, before unconsciously slipping into the performative patterns established in childhood. 14 minutes today without any echo behaviors, he recorded with evident pride. "When Mother's letter arrived, I felt the immediate pull to respond as both of us, but resisted for nearly 3 hours before capitulating." His university roommate, tracked through alumni records, and now in his late 90s, provided invaluable insight into this period. Edward would stand before the mirror practicing facial expressions, then suddenly freeze and say, "That's not me," he recalled. He once explained he was trying to determine which smile was actually his and which belonged to someone else. Most revealing was the ritual Edward performed on his birthday each year. Rather than celebrations, he treated the day as what he termed an exorcism of shared experience. University receipts show he purchased 2 small cakes annually, placing one before a mirror and consuming it while the reflection remained untouched, his way of visually reinforcing that only one person existed. The birthday photograph functioned as both catalyst and evidence of a psychological doubling that Edward spent most of his adult life trying to undo. His camera became his primary tool in this effort, a device that forced recognition of physical reality over emotional construction. "Photography demands acknowledgement of what stands before the lens," he wrote. "Light cannot capture wishful thinking. This is why I trust it more than memory or emotion. It shows only what is, never what might have been." Late in life, Edward gave a single interview to a psychology journal where he articulated the lasting impact of his unusual childhood. "I still sometimes wake uncertain which memories are truly mine," he admitted. "I've lived with the persistent sense that parts of my personality were borrowed, traits cultivated not from authentic development, but from desperate preservation of someone who existed primarily in my mother's imagination." The birthday photograph that began our investigation represents more than a manipulated image. It documents the beginning of an identity fracture that would take Edward decades to recognize and address, a moment when grief's distortion of reality permanently altered the psychological development of a child who would spend his entire life attempting to discover which parts of himself were actually his own. The local museum's basement archive yielded an unexpected connection to Edward's story. Among donated items was a collection from Dr. Helena Morris, a child psychologist who practiced in the area from 1928 through 1952. Her case files, recently unsealed after the mandated privacy period, contained a folder simply labeled EA, Persistent Identity Displacement. Dr. Morris had treated Edward briefly in his 30s when he sought professional help during what he described as an identity crisis following his father George's death. Her detailed notes documented techniques she developed specifically for Edward's unusual condition. "Patient demonstrates what I term phantom twin integration," she wrote. "Unlike traditional dissociative disorders, he maintains awareness of the separate identity he was conditioned to perform. His struggle is not with unexpected personality shifts, but with the deliberate performance becoming involuntary after decades of reinforcement." Her therapy included experimental approaches involving photography. In one session, she asked Edward to photograph himself daily for a month, then identify elements in each image that felt authentically him, versus characteristics he recognized as performative. The resulting photographs preserved in her files show subtle but distinct differences in posture, expression, and even how light seemed to interact with his features. Most intriguing is patient's description of feeling more solid when consciously suppressing the performed identity, Dr. Morris noted. He reports that when actively maintaining only his authentic self, objects feel more substantial to his touch and colors appear more vivid, as if he's fully present in reality rather than partially existing in an imaginary construct. The therapy sessions abruptly ended after 3 months. Dr. Morris's final entry explains, "Patient terminated treatment following what he described as a breakthrough during a cemetery visit. He placed photographs of himself on both his brother's authentic grave and the decoy headstone his mother had established. He reports experiencing a moment of clarity upon seeing his adult face above both markers, recognition that only one person had actually lived to create these images. Perhaps most valuable was a letter Edward sent Dr. Morris years later, in 1951. In it, he describes his evolving relationship with the birthday photograph. I keep it now not as family history, but as documentation of psychological colonization, a moment when adult grief overwhelmed a child's right to singular existence. The camera captured not just an image, but the precise moment when I was taught that my authentic self was insufficient to heal others' pain. I had to become two people to deserve love. Photography became my profession because cameras force recognition of physical truth. The lens acknowledges only what exists before it. My childhood experience taught me that human perception is dangerously malleable, bending reality to accommodate emotion. The camera refuses such compromise. In this way, each photograph I take reaffirms a single unified reality, something I was denied as a child. Dr. Morris later presented Edward's case, with identifying details removed, at a psychological conference, introducing what she termed inherited identity syndrome, a condition where surviving family members unconsciously incorporate characteristics of deceased loved ones, not from genuine psychological fracture, but from environmental conditioning and emotional coercion. The culmination of our research led us to the attic of Edward's final home, where Marion discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside lay a sealed metal case containing what appeared to be Edward's most private work, a series of experimental photographs unlike anything in his professional portfolio. These images, created in the months before his death, employed a technique he had perfected after decades of research: multiple exposures on specially treated plates that captured what he called temporal resonance. Each photograph showed the same subject taken at different moments, layered into a single image that revealed change over time. The most striking was a self-portrait series Edward had created using an automated timer. The first showed him as an elderly man seated beside an empty chair. The second captured the same scene, but the chair contained a faint, translucent figure, unmistakably Edward himself, but somehow different in subtle ways. In the third image, both figures appeared equally substantial, facing one another across the table. On the back of this final photograph, Edward had written, "The separation is complete. 77 years to untangle what was done in an instant." Marion revealed that in his final weeks, Edward had spoken of achieving resolution after a lifetime of internal division. He told me he had finally managed to externalize the brother he'd been forced to carry within himself. She explained that he could now see Thomas as separate from himself for the first time. Medical records from his last physician indicated Edward had reported an unusual experience, the sensation of becoming lighter, as if shedding half his existence. The doctor had attributed this to age-related confusion, but Edward's journal suggested something more deliberate. "The birthday photograph was the beginning of my fragmentation," he wrote in his final entry. "It seems fitting that photography should also be the means of my reintegration. I have externalized him at last, not as ghost or memory, but as the separate person he should have been allowed to remain. What was torn asunder by grief has been restored through understanding." Most unsettling was what Marion experienced after discovering these photographs. While handling them in Edward's study, she reported feeling a sudden temperature drop and the distinct impression of someone sitting in what had been Edward's favorite chair. When she instinctively took a photograph of the seemingly empty room, the developed image showed a subtle distortion of light around the chair, a human-shaped absence in the visual field. "Grandfather spent his life trying to separate himself from an identity that was forced upon him," Marion told us. In his final work, he wasn't documenting ghosts in the traditional sense, but something perhaps more profound: the visualization of identity itself, freed from the physical constraints of having to occupy a single body. The birthday photograph that began our investigation now reveals its most disturbing implication: that identities interrupted by grief and manipulation might continue seeking resolution long after the physical forms that house them have gone. Edward's lifelong struggle with his doubled existence suggests that what we perceive as a single human life maybe more fluid, more divisible than we care to acknowledge. Our final journey into Edward's world took us to the town cemetery, not to Thomas's actual grave, but to the second memorial Elizabeth had commissioned. We arrived at dusk, when shadows stretched across weathered stones. The twin graves, one containing remains, one merely symbolic, stood on opposite sides of town, as if even in death, Elizabeth couldn't bear to acknowledge the singularity of her loss. The caretaker, a man in his 70s, approached as we examined the empty memorial. "You're not the first to come asking about those twin stones," he said quietly. The grandson used to visit both graves regularly. "Edward's son?" we asked, surprised by this previously undiscovered connection. "Every month without fail until his passing 5 years ago," the caretaker confirmed. Strangest thing, he'd place identical flowers at both sites, then take photographs of the graves from precisely the same angle. Said he was maintaining the symmetry his grandmother had established. This revelation suggested the family pattern had extended beyond Edward, affecting even those who knew the truth from the beginning. Edward's son, though fully aware of the fabrication, had continued the ritual of acknowledging both graves, as if some essential balance would be disturbed by treating them differently. We obtained permission to examine burial records, discovering that Edward's final request had been particularly specific. His will stipulated that upon his death, identical portions of his ashes be interred at both grave sites, the real and the fictitious, with the remainder scattered at the location where the birthday photograph had been taken. He said he'd carried his brother long enough in life, Marion explained when we shared this discovery. In death, he wanted to distribute the weight he'd carried. Grandfather believed that by dividing his remains between the two sites, he could finally resolve what he called the doubled existence. Most revealing was the letter Edward left for the cemetery groundskeeper, included with prepayment for perpetual care of both plots. These graves represent not just two brothers, but the division of what should have been a single, unfractured identity. One contains the boy who died. The other commemorates the half of myself I was never permitted to fully become. By joining my remains with both, I hope to finally achieve the integration that life denied me. The birthday photograph that initiated our investigation now reveals itself not merely as documentation of family tragedy or photographic manipulation, but as the genesis point of an existential fracturing that spanned generations. The 5 candles on that cake marked not just the celebration of life, but the beginning of a profound identity distortion that Edward spent his entire existence trying to reconcile. As technology advanced, Edward had tried repeatedly to use newer photographic methods to analyze the original birthday image, seeking evidence that might explain his lifelong sense of division. His final notebook contained spectral analyses showing unusual light patterns around both children, anomalies he believed might represent not just photographic artifacts, but the actual visualization of identity being divided and redistributed through the camera's lens. The true horror of the twins' birthday photograph lies not in supernatural manipulation, but in its documentation of the exact moment when grief transformed from private emotion into an external force, one powerful enough to fragment a child's developing sense of self so profoundly that even death could not fully restore his singular existence. Among Edward's university papers, we discovered a thesis project he had abandoned, a photographic study contrasting pairs of identical twins with single portraits of individual children. His advisor's notes questioned why Edward had suddenly withdrawn the proposal, suggesting it showed exceptional promise and unique psychological insight. The answer emerged from Marion's childhood journals. She recalled visiting her grandfather's darkroom as a young girl, where he was developing twin portraits for a local family. He began trembling so badly he dropped the developing tray, she wrote. Chemical solution spilled everywhere, ruining the images. He sent the family away with their sitting fee refunded, then locked himself in the bathroom for hours. I heard him repeating, "I cannot see which one is real," over and over. This incident occurred in 1954, shortly after Edward had attempted to restart his academic research into visual identity. The family whose portraits he'd been developing, the Hawthorns, had identical twin daughters. Their father later wrote a confused letter to Edward, preserved in business correspondence, asking why he refused to reschedule their session when, "Capturing our girls together is all my wife has talked about for months." Edward's response was cryptic but revealing. Some doubles should remain undocumented. The camera creates a permanent record, but it also creates a third existence, the image itself, which continues influencing perception long after the subjects have changed or departed. I cannot in good conscience contribute to any process that might confuse essential singularity. Most striking was a technical journal we found among Edward's personal effects, detailing specialized camera modifications he had developed. He had created a unique twin-lens system that captured two perspectives simultaneously, but printed them as separate images rather than combining them. His notes explain, "The traditional approach merges viewpoints into a unified reality. My method maintains the integrity of separate perspectives, acknowledging multiplicity without forcing artificial convergence." This specialized equipment became his exclusive tool for family photography. Each image of his own children exists as paired photographs, two perspectives of the same moment, mounted side by side rather than overlapped. "Reality is always experienced individually," he wrote. "The pretense of a single unified viewpoint is the first step toward the kind of fiction that consumed my childhood." The ultimate irony emerged when we examined Edward's death certificate. The physician who pronounced his passing in 1982 had inadvertently recorded the wrong birth date, listing not Edward's actual birth but the falsified later date Elizabeth had created for Thomas's second headstone. This administrative error meant that, officially, it was Thomas who lived the full life while Edward's existence remained unrecorded in final documentation, a last reversal of the identities that had been tangled since childhood. Marion has preserved her grandfather's photographic innovations, though she admits the equipment remains largely untouched. "Some tools carry too much weight," she told us. His cameras weren't just for capturing light, they were instruments for separating what grief had fused together. I honor his work by remembering the story, not by continuing the obsession. The haunting remnants of Edward's life continue to influence the present in unexpected ways. Marion recently discovered several cassette tapes labeled simply "Night Sessions" in her grandfather's handwriting, recorded in his final year. After locating a vintage player, she shared these disturbing audio documents with us. The recordings reveal Edward speaking in two distinct voices, his normal elderly tone alternating with a softer, slightly higher-pitched version that appears to represent how he imagined Thomas might have sounded had he lived to old age. These nocturnal conversations, conducted when Edward believed himself unobserved, show him systematically transferring memories to his brother. "You should take this one," Edward's natural voice says on one recording. "The summer fishing trip when Father taught us to tie flies. That feels more like yours than mine. I'm giving it to you completely." The altered voice then recounts the memory in first person, as if accepting ownership of the experience. This methodical division of his life history suggests Edward was preparing for death by ensuring that when he departed, he would leave as a single, unified person rather than the fragmented identity he had maintained for decades. The town library archives yielded another revelation through microfiche newspaper records. In 1964, a devastating fire destroyed several buildings near the town square, including the original photography studio where the birthday portrait was created. Edward, then living 50 miles away, returned immediately upon hearing the news. According to witness accounts documented in local reporting, he rushed into the burning building despite firefighters' attempts to restrain him. He emerged minutes later, coat wrapped around something clutched to his chest, suffering serious burns that required hospitalization. The object he rescued wasn't the family birthday photograph as one might expect, but the original glass plate negative from which it had been printed. Laboratory notes found among his effects show he spent months developing specialized chemical treatments to analyze the plate's emulsion, believing it contained perceptual information invisible to ordinary observation. "The negative holds the true record," he wrote after his recovery. "The print merely shows what light revealed, but the negative captures what light couldn't touch. The spaces between perception where reality divides." Most disturbing was our discovery that Edward had adapted his father's original photographic manipulation technique for therapeutic purposes. Several local families who lost children in a school bus accident in 1976 received anonymous gifts. Carefully constructed photographs showing their deceased children at what would have been their high school graduation. The technical brilliance of these images made the manipulations undetectable to untrained eyes. Only Marion recognized her grandfather's distinctive technique, confirming our suspicion that Edward had created them. Unlike the deception practiced on him as a child, however, these images were accompanied by letters explicitly acknowledging their nature as compassionate fictions rather than attempted replacements for reality. This image offers not continuation but completion, one letter stated. A glimpse of what might have been, to be viewed alongside acceptance of what is. The photograph exists as possibility, not as denial. The difference has defined my life. The photograph leaves us with questions that may never be fully answered. Were the chemical treatments Edward developed actually capturing some form of emotional residue, or were they simply manifestations of his desperate need to understand his fractured existence? The boundary between scientific inquiry and psychological coping mechanism blurs in his later work. What remains clear is how a single image, one birthday moment captured in 1909, created ripples that extended across 4 generations of a family. The twins' birthday photograph functioned as both document and catalyst, recording a moment while simultaneously altering the reality it purported to preserve. Elizabeth's neighbors, interviewed as part of our research, recalled her insistence that visitors acknowledge both children even decades after Thomas's death. "You'd be invited for tea," one elderly woman remembered, "and she'd correct you if you only greeted Edward." The empty chair beside him always had a place setting, a napkin folded just so. You learned to nod in its direction or risk sending her into tears. Perhaps most telling was the small detail Marion discovered when sorting through Edward's possessions. A child-sized sailor outfit identical to those in the birthday photograph, preserved in cedar with mothballs, discovered in his closet after his death. The fabric showed no signs of wear, suggesting it had never been used, yet Edward had carried it through multiple moves across 7 decades. When we examined hospital records from Edward's final weeks, his attending physician noted an unusual request. Edward had asked that the second bed in his semi-private room remain unoccupied, yet he would turn toward it during conversations, pausing as if listening to responses from the empty space. It wasn't dementia, the doctor assured us. He was completely lucid, aware of what he was doing. When I finally asked about it directly, he smiled and said, "Old habits. I've spent a lifetime making room for someone who isn't here. Too late to change now." The birthday photograph that began our investigation ultimately reveals itself as neither wholly fabrication nor supernatural phenomenon, but something perhaps more unsettling, evidence of how grief can reshape reality so profoundly that the boundaries between truth and fiction dissolve. The camera captured not just an image, but the beginning of a psychological restructuring that would define multiple lives for generations. Edward's final artistic statement was perhaps his most powerful, a series of self-portraits taken in the weeks before his death. Using long exposures and subtle movement, he created images where his features appear doubled, then gradually separate into 2 distinct profiles facing away from each other. The last photograph shows only a single, clear face, finally unified, looking directly into the lens with an expression of profound peace. The inscription below this final image reads simply, "One candle now, at last." The curator of the university archive where Edward's photographs are housed contacted us unexpectedly. An elderly woman had donated a collection of personal effects that included correspondence with Edward spanning 3 decades. The donor, Eleanor Whitfield, had been Edward's darkroom assistant in the 1950s. "There's something about the twins' photograph you should know," her letter explained. "Edward confided in me during a particularly difficult darkroom session. He was attempting to create a special chemical process to unmix the combined image, to separate himself from Thomas definitively. We arranged to meet Eleanor at her retirement community. Despite her 92 years, her recollections remained crystal clear, particularly regarding Edward's obsession with the birthday photograph. He believed the camera had done more than document a deception, she told us, hands trembling slightly as she sipped her tea. He was convinced it had actually created a form of quantum entanglement between himself and the brother who never truly existed. Eleanor described Edward's theory that the specialized double exposure technique used by Abernathy had created more than a photographic illusion. It had generated what Edward termed a persistent perceptual field that continued affecting those who viewed it, particularly himself. He spent years trying to develop a counter-process, Eleanor explained. A photographic technique that would undo the entanglement. He called it optical disentanglement, exposing new plates through specialized filters that would separate the wavelengths that had been combined in the original exposure. The breakthrough came when Edward was 74. After countless failed experiments, he created a new version of the birthday photograph using his disentanglement technique. Eleanor witnessed the moment he first viewed the result. The print showed only Edward clearly visible, while Thomas appeared as merely a faint outline, almost a shadow. Edward wept when he saw it. "He's finally letting me go," he said. It was the first time I ever saw him truly smile. Most revealing was what happened immediately after this breakthrough. Edward's lifelong habit of unconsciously setting two places at meals, of checking reflections for a second face, of answering to both names, all ceased within weeks. His physician noted remarkable improvements in his blood pressure and sleep patterns, as if a lifetime of physiological stress had suddenly lifted. He burned the original photograph that night, Eleanor told us, said its work was finished. He kept only the new version showing the separation. That's when he began creating his final self-portraits, documenting what he called his return to singularity. The mystery of the twins' birthday photograph finally resolves itself not as supernatural phenomenon or simple deception, but as something far more profound. Evidence of how perception shapes reality at the most fundamental level. The camera had indeed captured more than light and shadow. It had immortalized a moment when grief's distortion became so powerful, it generated its own persistent reality. Edward's final journal entry, shared by Eleanor from her personal collection, provides perhaps the most fitting conclusion. We create ghosts not through death, but through the refusal to acknowledge it. The camera shows us only what we place before it, both the visible and invisible elements we arrange and frame. I have spent a lifetime learning that the most powerful lens is the one through which we choose to view ourselves. As the investigation draws to a close, one final document transforms our understanding of Edward's story completely. Hidden beneath the lining of the photograph's original frame, Marion discovered a yellowed letter written by George, Edward's father, dated October 3, 1909, addressed to the family physician. I can no longer maintain this charade. Elizabeth's condition worsens daily, but I must confess the true circumstances before her delusion consumes what remains of our family. There never were twins. Edward was our only child, the Thomas. Elizabeth mourned so desperately was a fabrication created during her difficult pregnancy. When complications arose in her 4th month, the doctor warned us to prepare for the loss of our child. Elizabeth, in her desperation, convinced herself she carried 2 babies, that even if one perished, another would survive. When Edward was born healthy and alone, she suffered a complete break with reality, insisting a second child had been delivered but hidden from her. Rather than institutionalizing her as doctors advised, I chose what seemed a merciful deception. I claimed the imagined twin had indeed existed but died shortly after birth. I believed her grief would follow a natural course toward acceptance. Instead, she created an ever more elaborate mythology around Thomas. When Edward reached an age to understand, I instructed him to participate in her delusion rather than confront her with reality. I now recognize the cruelty of this decision, forcing a child to validate his mother's psychosis by pretending to be 2 people. The birthday photograph was my desperate attempt to provide Elizabeth with tangible proof that might satisfy her demands for Thomas's presence, hoping it would allow her fixation to gradually subside. Instead, it reinforced her delusion and further fractured Edward's developing sense of self. There never was a second grave, no parish record of Thomas's death. Elizabeth created these artifacts herself, placing them in locations where she knew I wouldn't discover them. The fiction extended beyond our home into the community through her careful, systematic efforts. I write this confession not to absolve myself, but to ensure Edward might someday understand that the brother he's been forced to conjure never existed at all. The emptiness he's been made to fill was created not by death, but by his mother's refusal to accept the limitations of reality itself. This revelation casts Edward's lifelong struggle in an entirely new light. He wasn't separating himself from a deceased twin's influence, but from a complete fiction, an identity created solely through his mother's psychosis and his father's misguided compassion. The horror of the twins' birthday photograph lies not in capturing a ghost or documenting grief's distortion, but in its role as fabricated evidence designed to validate a delusion that consumed 3 lives. Edward spent his entire existence trying to disentangle himself from someone who never existed at all, a phantom brother conjured not by supernatural forces, but by the more terrifying power of human minds to create and sustain their own realities, even at devastating cost. Our discovery about Thomas's complete non-existence altered everything about the case. The birthday photograph wasn't just manipulated, it was pure fabrication, documenting a child who never drew breath. Each clue we had followed became suspect. Every supposed echo of Thomas's presence revealed itself as the product of Elizabeth's determined psychosis and the community's willingness to sustain her delusion. Marian sat silently for nearly 20 minutes after reading her great-grandfather's confession, then whispered, "My entire family history is built around someone who never existed." We revisited key locations, now seeing them through this revelatory lens. The photography studio hadn't specialized in comfort photography for grieving families, but in creating elaborate visual evidence for psychological fabrications. Abernathy's private notes took on disturbing new meaning. His comfort photography served not to include deceased loved ones, but to manufacture fictional ones, enabling delusions rather than processing grief. The medical records we'd examined showed doctors had been treating Elizabeth for what they tactfully termed phantasmal fixation, rather than conventional grief. Her physicians knew the truth but maintained the facade, believing confrontation would trigger complete psychological collapse. Most haunting was our return to the cemetery. The grave Edward had believed contained his brother held nothing at all. Cemetery records revealed George had purchased the plot, but no burial had occurred. The headstone marked only Elizabeth's conviction, carved in granite but signifying nothing below. "I've been maintaining an empty grave my entire adult life," Marian said, placing fresh flowers beside the marker. "Caring for the resting place of someone who never lived." The psychological implications proved most profound. Edward hadn't been struggling to separate from a deceased brother's influence, but from a complete fiction that had been presented to him as reality from his earliest memories. His phantom twin integration wasn't an adaptation to loss, but a response to being forced to validate a psychosis through his own performance. "It's almost worse," Dr. Winthrop noted when we consulted her with our findings. "Imagine discovering your entire sense of self was partially constructed around accommodating someone who never existed. The violation of identity is profound, not just divided, but partially fabricated from the beginning." Edward's photography career revealed itself as more than artistic expression. His obsession with documenting objective reality wasn't merely aesthetic, but existential. Each photograph he took served as confirmation that what appeared before his lens actually existed, a constant reassurance he desperately needed after childhood. The birthday photograph now represents something far more disturbing than mourning manipulation. It stands as evidence of how reality itself can be constructed through collective agreement, how a mother's delusion, a father's misguided compassion, and a community's accommodation could create a person who never existed so convincingly that his non-existence shaped 4 generations of a family. "The candles on that cake," Marian observed during our final meeting, weren't marking another year of life. They were illuminating the moment when fiction became more powerful than truth, when a photograph didn't just capture reality, but replaced it entirely. The photograph that had shaped generations rests now in a special display at the University Archive, encased in museum-quality glass with carefully controlled humidity. Not the original, that was consumed in Edward's ritual burning, but the disentangled version he created, showing himself clearly while Thomas exists only as a faint outline, a visual representation of fiction separating from fact. Marian decided against keeping it in the family. "Some objects carry too much weight across generations," she explained during the donation ceremony. better to transform it from private burden to public education. The university created a small exhibition around it, titled Constructed Realities, Photography, Psychology, and Perception, featuring Edwards' technical notes and selections from his experimental work. Psychology students now regularly study the case, examining how visual evidence can create and reinforce psychological constructs even when that evidence is entirely fabricated. Marion found unexpected peace in releasing the photograph to public scrutiny. "Secrets maintained for protection become poisons over time," she told us during our final meeting. "4 generations carried this weight. It ends with my decision to bring it into the light." She has since worked with trauma specialists, examining how inherited family mythologies shape identity even in those who never experienced the original deception. Her own children, now understanding their heritage, report feeling strangely liberated. "We thought we were carrying grief for a lost ancestor," her daughter explained. "Instead, we were maintaining the energy of something that never existed at all. The empty grave remains, though Marion had the option to remove it. It stands as testimony now," she decided. "Not to Thomas, but to the power of human minds to create entire realities that others must accommodate." She replaced the headstone with a simpler marker that reads only, "Memory without matter, 1909. Perhaps most healing was the ritual Marion performed on what would have been the twins' 115th birthday. She gathered her children and grandchildren at the family home, setting a single place at the table with a single candle. "Today we celebrate just Edward," she announced. "One life, fully acknowledged. One candle for one person who actually existed." The local historical society has preserved Abernathy's photography studio, though with significant contextual information about its role in creating and sustaining community delusions. Tours now include discussions about the ethics of photography and truth, how images shape perception, even when they fundamentally distort reality. Edwards' specialized cameras and chemical formulas have found unexpected purpose in modern psychological research. Contemporary therapists have adapted his disentanglement techniques for visual therapy with patients suffering from identity disorders, creating images that help them separate their authentic selves from constructed identities they've been forced to maintain. The birthday photograph that began our investigation has transformed from family secret to educational tool, its disturbing power now harnessed for understanding rather than deception. The 5 candles that once illuminated a fabricated celebration now shed light on the profound human capacity to construct, maintain, and eventually dismantle realities that exist only through collective agreement to see what was never truly there. The final pages of Edwards' journals, written in the trembling hand of his last weeks, reveal a man who had achieved a profound reconciliation with his manufactured past. "The photograph served its purpose," he wrote. "It created the fiction that shaped me, then helped me dismantle what never should have been. The camera's eye both imprisoned and ultimately freed me." What we hadn't fully appreciated until now was how Edwards' understanding of his situation had evolved beyond personal trauma into something approaching philosophical inquiry. His later writings explore how easily human perception can be structured around complete fabrications when supported by seemingly tangible evidence. "We require so little to believe," he noted. "A single image, presented with authority, can create an entire history that never occurred. If a simple photograph could convince a child he was 2 people, what other fundamental misconceptions might we all carry, supported by evidence equally flawed?" The local library recently discovered recordings of Edwards' last public lecture at the university in 1980. Standing before photography students, his voice steady despite his advancing years, he shared the truth about the birthday photograph for the first time publicly. "What you must understand about photography is not merely its technical aspects, but its dangerous power," he told them. "The camera creates reality as much as it captures it. My mother needed a world with 2 sons, so through photographic manipulation, that world was manufactured. The evidence of your eyes becomes the structure of your understanding. I spent 70 years unlearning what a single photograph taught me to believe about myself." Marion found evidence of Edwards' final reconciliation in his appointment calendar. Each year on his birthday, from 1975 until his death, he had visited a local orphanage, bringing cameras for the children and teaching basic photography. The orphanage director remembered him saying, "These children need to create their own visual evidence of existence, not have their stories written by others." Perhaps most poignant was the letter Edward wrote to his unborn great-grandchildren, sealed and entrusted to Marion with instructions to share it when they reached adulthood. "You inherit not just genetic material, but narrative," he wrote. "The story of Thomas, a person who never existed yet shaped our family for generations, should teach you to question even the most convincing evidence of what you believe to be true. The camera can lie, memory can deceive. Only by constant questioning can we approach something resembling truth." In his final act before hospitalization, Edward returned to the birthday photograph one last time. Using his most advanced disentanglement techniques, he processed the image until only the cake with its 5 candles remained clearly visible, both children having faded to near transparency. Beneath this image, he wrote what serves as perhaps the most fitting epitaph for his extraordinary life. "The candles were real. The light was real. Everything else was negotiable." This investigation leaves us with the sobering understanding that the boundaries between documentation and creation, between evidence and fabrication, remain dangerously permeable. The photograph that began as celebration, transformed into mourning ritual, and finally served as psychological prison, now exists as warning. A reminder of how easily seeing can become believing, even when what we see has been carefully constructed to deceive. The birthday photograph now rests in a specialized archival box within the university's psychology department, a teaching tool used to demonstrate how visual evidence can both reflect and create reality. Students sit before it in hushed contemplation, unaware that they too participate in its ongoing story, each viewer adding another layer of perception, another set of eyes that see both what is and what never was. Marion contacted us recently with news that renovations at the original family home had uncovered something unexpected beneath the dining room floorboards. A child-sized box containing primitive photographs taken by Edward himself around age 6. Using a simple box camera his father had given him, he had secretly documented his daily performances as both children. These haunting images show Edward meticulously changing clothes, altering his hair, shifting his expression to become Thomas, practicing his transformations with the serious dedication of a child who believed his mother's love depended on his successful portrayal of 2 distinct people. Most revealing was a crude self-portrait showing Edward staring into a mirror, the camera positioned to capture both his reflection and his physical self, an early attempt to visualize his divided existence. On the back, in childish handwriting, "Me looking at not me." The birthday photograph that began our investigation has found purpose beyond its original deception. Therapists now use Edward's story when working with individuals struggling with identity formation under familial pressure. "The candles on that cake illuminate not just celebration," one psychologist explained, but the moment when external expectations began literally reshaping a child's understanding of himself. Edward's granddaughter Marion has established a foundation dedicated to visual literacy education, helping children understand how photographic evidence can be manipulated to create false narratives. Each year, the foundation hosts an exhibition where student photographers create works exploring the theme of authentic identity versus external expectation. The 5 candles on that century-old cake continue casting their light, no longer illuminating a false celebration, but instead revealing how easily reality can be constructed, maintained, and passed through generations through nothing more substantial than a silver gelatin print and the collective agreement to believe what it purports to show. The twins' birthday photograph serves as a reminder that the most profound horror lies not in supernatural occurrences, but in the human capacity to create realities that imprison others, and our willingness to inhabit those prisons rather than confront uncomfortable truths. In Edward's final journal entry, found tucked behind the photograph itself, he wrote, "The camera supposedly never lies, yet mine began with deception. I've spent a lifetime seeking truth through the same medium that first distorted my reality. Perhaps that's the ultimate power of photography, its ability to both create and dismantle the stories we tell ourselves about who we truly are." Another photograph, another dark secret revealed. Until next time, this has been Shadow Frames.